Hey, Psych students, it is our very last lecture of the semester. I realized that this is not necessarily the way that we were planning on the end of the semester to go, but I'm glad that you saw it through. I'm glad that you stuck it out, and I'm really glad that you were in my class this semester. So a couple of things that I wanted to bring up really quick. So our Psych final is already online. It will post next week. You'll have a week to take it. It'll be 2 hours. You can only take it once. Open book, open note, and the study guide is already up for the exam if you want to start taking a look at that. I would also add that if you have neglected to send any homework assignments to me or the infographic project, if you could make sure that I get those by next Friday, May 8th, that would be wonderful. That is our last day of classes, and I will take assignments up until then. I may have some other things in mind if not everybody is able to turn in all their assignments, but I don't necessarily want to talk about that yet. I want to see if you can get those in first before I take slightly more extreme measures. So let's go ahead. We're going to finish up our semester by talking a little bit about leadership and power. Now, if you've had me for social psych, or if you have taken some of Dr. Kleit's leadership classes, some of this might sound a little bit familiar to you. So we're going to talk about what we mean by leadership. We're going to talk about influence and power and a couple of different examples of abuses of power. We're going to consider different aspects of leadership, how we think about leadership, and then finish up by talking about gender roles, in particular women in leadership. So we're going to start by talking about what leadership is. Now, what does it take to be a leader? Now, I will be absolutely straight with you. I will level with you. I said the thing at Cotty that you're probably not supposed to say. So it kind of, a couple of years ago, if you'd asked me, do you see yourself as a leader? I'd go, nah, I'm not really a very good leader. I'm an excellent second in command, though. So it's really easy to think of this prototypical leader and kind of look at your own personality traits and characteristics and be like, well, I don't really fit into that. But it turns out that, as we're going to see, the idea of what it is to be a leader and what it takes to be a leader is far more broad than you would expect. So is leadership based on the decisions that you make? Is it based on your personality characteristics or the behaviors that a person engages with? Is it based on your character? Well, here's a pretty intuitive definition of what it takes to be a leader. Some people would think that a leader is in charge of other people, but here's the thing. Just because you're in charge doesn't mean that people will necessarily follow you. So generally what we found is that when researchers try to pin down a definition of leadership, it's really difficult for everybody to agree. But regardless, there do seem to be some pretty common threads. First of all, there is some kind of influence that is involved. So a leader does actually have to influence people in some sort of way. So what does this look like at work? Typically, this means that this will be some kind of supervisory role. Again, just because you're in charge doesn't mean that you will actually have influence over people. And so I know that from my perspective, especially since I've had to teach about this every time I teach Psych, I am reminded that even if I don't necessarily feel that I have the qualities that a leader will have, I do have influence over people. And that does mean that under certain circumstances, yes, I am in fact a leader. And I'm sure that you can look at the influence that you have in people, over people in your own lives, and see how that works as well. Now, leadership can be formal. So it can be formalized through a position of some kind, or like being a committee chair or something like that, but it can also be an informal sort of leadership. Oftentimes you'll see that in friend groups, there's probably a leader. Oftentimes we will find, at least at work, that informal leadership will develop through interacting with coworkers. Even if they are not a leader in name, they are treated as somebody with great power and with great influence. So what sort of factors affect influence, and how does all of this relate to the concept of power? So we have to get into some work that was originally done by French and Raven in 1959. And if you had me for social psych last spring, you might have remembered me talking a little bit about the 5 bases of power. So really quick, French and Raven basically define power with the extent to which you can influence somebody to do something. So for example, I know that I occasionally have power as a professor because I say, hey, you all need to be here to take your test, or hey, you all need to turn in your papers at a certain time. And what I tend to find is that most of you do it. So that does show that power is there. So you can influence somebody to do something. I've occasionally heard people say that my going on runs makes them want to go running. That is another case of exerting power, albeit not in a formalized way. So there are 5 bases of power. These can either involve personal characteristics or organizational conditions. And by and large, they are going to describe the type of leader-follower relationship that you are going to have. So here are what those 5 are. So before we get into what those 5 are, though, the leader is basically going to make some type of attempt to influence behavior. The behavior of the subordinate or the follower will determine whether the influence actually worked. So what are our bases of power? So we have expert power, referent power, legitimate power, reward power, and coercive power. So let's start by talking a little bit about expert power. Expert power is actually something that we are kind of running into quite a bit these days. We're a lot more likely to listen to the opinions, the ideas, the guidelines, and the suggestions that people make if they have the expertise. So expert power is basically when influence is based on the knowledge and the expertise of the supervisor, and the subordinate will follow because of the belief in leader's knowledge. Now, every subordinate is probably going to have different ideas as to whether or not this person is an expert. So for example, you can kind of see this right now. I have seen friends and family members share videos of a chiropractor basically having guidelines and ideas for what to do during the pandemic. And while for them, that is certainly enough expert power. I mean, they're a chiropractor, they're a doctor, right? I don't necessarily see it that way. I will not be influenced by somebody who is a chiropractor when it comes to an infectious disease. A chiropractor is looking at muscular and skeletal issues and not a respiratory virus. So really, whether or not you follow is based on your belief in the knowledge that somebody has. And that's why, for example, you listen to me when I talk to you about ways to study for tests and on memory and things like that, because I'm an expert in those things. You probably aren't going to listen to me if I'm talking to you about, if I'm necessarily talking to you about infectious diseases myself, because that's not my area of expertise. Now, here's what's critical. It's about the belief in the expertise, not the actual expertise itself. That's why some people do listen to a chiropractor when it comes to these things, because it's about belief in expertise, not the actual expertise. And it's often why people don't take into account expert knowledge because they don't believe in the expert's knowledge, or they believe that that knowledge is tainted in some way. You kind of see this with when people bring out psychology studies. You'll hear people go, oh, well, psychology's not a real science anyway, or psychology's having trouble replicating. Why should we listen to them? And it's one of those cases where there may be actual expertise there, but if you don't believe it, there's not going to be any power there. So in addition to this, titles, degrees, certifications, and awards will lend further influence. I would also say that some of the symbols of those degrees and certifications and awards will lend further influence as well. In the case of the chiropractor videos, he's wearing scrubs. Well, doctors wear scrubs, well, don't they? So that might confer a little bit more authority. Likewise, there was a video that came out about sanitizing groceries. Again, this doctor was not an infectious disease doctor or a virologist or an epidemiologist. He was doing family practice. You do not need to wash your fruit with soap and water. It's going to be really bad for you. But this is a case of, again, belief in the power of expertise rather than the actual expertise itself. Referent power. So this is when influence comes through the subordinate basically liking and identifying with the leader. You are a lot more likely to be influenced by somebody if you like them. So this could be why if your friend is wearing a certain style and you really like it and you think it's cool, you're going to be more likely to emulate the looks of your friend because of that influence and because you like them. Generally, this can either be developed through a personal relationship, somebody that you're friends with, somebody that you want to like you, or through the raising of status. So, for example, celebrity endorsements are a perfect example of referent power. So when I put on a pair of Air Jordans, does that necessarily mean that I am going to play like Michael Jordan or that Michael Jordan will actually end up liking me? Probably not. But if I have the cool shoes that Michael Jordan recommends, people will say, wow, she's got the Air Jordans. Michael Jordan really likes those shoes. And so because of that, that will give me status that I otherwise would not have because of that celebrity endorsement. Legitimate power. So this is a case where power is basically conferred through one's title. Now here's what's really critical. Just as we saw with expert power, it is not about the actual expertise, it's about the belief in the expertise. Here, legitimate power comes from the subordinate's belief that the leader has a legitimate right to be in charge. If you think that the leader has no right to be there and is not doing a good job, you are not going to get that subordinate to follow you. You will have no influence. So it's absolutely contingent upon the subordinate's recognition of the authority of the leader. So that's a case where just because you are in power does not imply that people will follow you. Just because you have that title does not mean that people will follow you unless they believe that you have the right to be there. Reward power. So this is based on the ability to reward subordinates, give out raises, promotions, good grades, so on. So yeah, it includes things like bonuses, promotions, raises, and good job assignments. But a problem with reward power is that generally subordinates might get used to receiving rewards and they may only perform if they're rewarded. Based on what we tend to see with students, they tend to be more responsive to professors that demonstrate reward power as well as expert power. Both of those seem to work really, really well, and students tend to like it when professors work from those bases of power. The flip side of reward power is coercive power. So this is related to the ability of the supervisor to punish subordinates for non-compliance. So that includes things like disciplinary actions, fines, salary reductions, firing, and so on. So for example, a professor may not necessarily have coercive power. What's the worst that can happen? A bad grade. And even then, a professor won't necessarily punish your behavior with a bad grade, or at least they shouldn't. Now, a dean, on the other hand, can absolutely have coercive power. You can get in trouble with the college if it escalates to the level of the dean. So the downside to coercive power is that subordinates are going to be more likely to be angry or frustrated, and that can lead to those counterproductive work behaviors that we generally want to avoid. One of the other things that we'll find, I did mention that students tend to like professors that are operating from expert power and reward power bases. They tend to like a lot less professors that are kind of operating from coercive power. And don't get me wrong, I have a feeling there are ways that you can punish students besides bad grades. I just tend to not do that. Okay, so power and politics. Now, again, we've kind of talked a little bit about politics earlier in class when we were talking about different types of job stressors. We are not referring to governmental politics. Here, we are focusing on how people gain and protect their power within an organization. So we're not necessarily talking about the government when we're talking about political power. We are talking about anybody who has power and the means that they will go through to try to keep and secure that power. Now, there are 3 means of securing power that were described by Yuki in 1989. There are a couple of different things that you can do. You can control the decision processes, you can form a coalition, or you can co-opt. So controlling decision processes includes basically trying to control and influence important parts of the decision-making process, like the allocation of resources. It's part of the reason why one of the most powerful committees in all of Congress is not necessarily the ones you'd think of, it's the Appropriations Committee, because the Appropriations Committee basically decides who gets what in the budget. When you form a coalition, you are basically entering agreements with other people, making alliances with other people to basically get different types of support. You will see this in legislative bodies, but you will also see this within the workplace. People might form alliances and coalitions to basically gain support and get power for certain decisions that they want to make. Co-opting is basically when you go against another faction or an opposition by basically trying to diffuse their frustration by allowing them to participate. So one example of co-opting that actually kind of came up a few years ago, so I'm on a committee that's in charge of assessment day, and so we were doing assessment day and we got a letter from somebody basically saying they didn't like how we did it. And so one of the things that we were talking about, because that was the last meeting of the semester, was, hey, why don't we, if this student really thinks they have a lot of important input and they don't think we did a good job, why don't we try to get them involved? We ended up not necessarily doing that, but if we had made that decision and invited the student to take part in this process, that would have been a case of co-opting. Where we could try to diffuse that by gaining their input. And so it's kind of basically twofold. There's kind of like twofold decisions here. So first of all, you're getting rid of your opposition. Second of all, you're getting another opportunity for more support and working toward a decision that would make a variety of people happy. Okay. So now let's talk a little bit more about controlling those decision processes. So as I kind of mentioned, this kind of political power is based on controlling and influencing decisions in the organization. This can include things like being on committees, particularly those, especially here for faculty, things like personnel and promotion. So groups that basically decide who gets tenure, who gets promoted, who doesn't. And as I mentioned, the Appropriations Committee that you would see in Congress. When you form a coalition, you're basically entering an agreement or forming an alliance with other people to gain support. In turn, you're going to support the other person's position. I know that nobody watches House of Cards. This is kind of a dated slide at this point, but the idea is if I do this for you, if I support this bill, you have to support me on this decision that I make. So if you've seen political dramas like The West Wing or The American President or House of Cards, you kind of get that scratch my back and I'll scratch yours kind of idea. And then co-optation, as I mentioned, this is when if you have opposition, you allow its members to participate in that decision-making process, and ideally it will be very difficult for them to remain opposed. So really quick, we can talk a bit about political skill. This is the extent to which you can influence others to engage in beneficial behaviors. And this will include the following dimensions. So first of all, that will include social astuteness, being able to understand people, how they work, and social situations. Interpersonal influence, so basically convincing other people to engage in desired behaviors. Networking, developing and managing relationships with others. Apparent sincerity, basically being open, honest, and trustworthy. And it's apparent to other people that it's there. So you need to make sure that people get the feeling that you are actually an honest person for that to work. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. Next time we will talk about abuses of leadership.